Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Terry Henne. I'm with WSGW Radio, the farm director here at WSGW. So happy to be with you to talk beans. We're talking beans today through the courtesy of BASF, where they create chemistry. Along with me this morning, I've got Scott Bales working out at the research farm between the Frankenmuth and Richville area. Scott, it's a bad hair day for some folks, but obviously not for you and me.
No, this haircut makes it pretty easy, doesn't it, Terry?
Yeah, it sure does. A little breezy out there today, but it's the end of November, first part of December. We're gearing up, getting ready for winter. And obviously, you are gearing up for what's going to be a pretty busy off season, so to speak, because you had a lot of work done over the summer. And it terminated with a report that came out, finished up. And I understand you have quite a bit of research to talk about for dry bean growers that might prove to be pretty interesting if they're going to put dry beans in next year.
That's for sure, Terry. We know we have a short research season in dry beans, only June to October. Some folks are jealous about that, but the winter does kick off, quite fast here. As we're thinking about seed and looking at those orders and rotations for next year already. So our extension bulletin E3465, so that is the bulletin that has all of our variety trial results in it. Has been published, and if you're on the Michigan Bean Commission mailing list, it's been mailed to your mailbox. So maybe you've seen that already. If you haven't, take a second look through your junk mail there. It's probably waiting for you. And if you're not on that mailing list, it is available online too, on the MichiganBeans.com website /research. You'll find that is the latest post there. And in that, you'll see all of the agronomic information, yield, the stuff that's important when we're thinking about seed for next year, published for 160 different varieties. So, when you're thinking about blacks, navies, small reds, what might fit in your rotation, what might not, maybe you're looking to diversify a little bit. It's a great starting point to really take a look at the document and understand what options you may have in your rotation. So that certainly gives us a lot to talk about at these upcoming winter meetings for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about number one, the number of pages of that report, and kind of glean it down for us just a little bit as far as highlights.
Yeah, for sure. So that document, we try to keep it short, but it is very dense. And anybody that's opened a typical variety trial type report knows that you typically want your ruler and a highlighter as you go through those lines by lines. But there's really two key tables that most are interested in. Tables 3 and 4 are black and navy bean results. Each one of those has 33 different entries in it. And about half of those are commercial. So really it can look a little bit overwhelming, but if you start to sort through those, and I always look for names, that's the easiest way to tell, what is a commercial line versus experimental. Experimentals are numbered typically. You can go through with your highlighter, highlight out those names, take a look at those yield results, and it really helps make it a little more digestible as we go.
Now, as far as the individual report things that you got in there, was it pretty much all centered around the research farm or some of the plots outside of the research farm?
Yep. So that is one of the things that's pretty unique by this. It is an MSU publication, but very little of that research is actually done here at the research farm. So these trials used to be called the PRAB variety trials, or Production Research Advisory Board within the Michigan Bean Commission. That's always focused on on-farm research. When my position came around about 5 years ago, we merged that into MSU, but we've kept that focus of this being on-farm research. So for the majority of these trials, they've got 4 different locations, all on-farm in Bay, Huron, Sanilac, and Tuscola counties. And then where we look at our kidney beans, we keep 2 locations of that testing, one over in Montcalm County near Howard City this year. And that second location is kept here on the research farm, as a dry land, non-irrigated type site to still look at those, kidneys and crayons and that dry land type production.
Now, let's go back to those tables that you were talking about. Anything in particular from those tables that jumps out at you?
So not too many big surprises this year, which is it's always a good thing as we kind of look at the trend of the market. The popular varieties that we've been watching for a good number of years now, and have been recommending are continuing to excel. You see a few new lines come into the market each year, which is exciting too. But our kind of standards that we've been talking a lot about for the past year or two really kind of rose to the top again this year. As we look at multi-year averages, that trend has continued. So for black beans, we've been talking a lot about varieties like Nimbus, Spectre, and Blackbeard. That has remained true, through 2021, and also looking at those multi-year averages. In navy beans, it's been a little bit newer on some of these lines. We've been talking about HMS Bounty, has been a really good navy bean for us that a lot of growers got experience with in 2022, a little bit in 2021 as well. But also we've got a few new lines, one called HMS Liberty that has been really exciting. Seems to be potentially a little bit better than Bounty. And we should see some more seed of that headed into 2023. So that's exciting. And also another one, HMS Victory. A little bit of a shorter maturity in the navy bean world, which is a good option that we haven't had in the past. So if that's important to somebody, it's a high performing line with that little bit shorter maturity. So those are all good things to see.
I'm just kind of curious, how did the shorter term varieties do this year as far as yield goes?
Yeah, so when our season is full like this year, we weren't cut short by any frost. Typically our longer maturities will out yield our shorter maturities. That's just a relationship in the genetics. It's really hard to break. That yield and maturity are kind of tied together like that. The longer the variety it is, the more yield potential it's got. And when we've got those days to finish out the season, like we did this year, those longer maturities typically will yield a little bit more. So if a grower does opt to take a shorter maturity, there is a bit of a trade-off there that they're probably going to give up a few percentage points in yield. But typically we have a reason for doing that. Either we're in northern Michigan, or we have a late planting date and we're concerned about when our wheat's going to go in that fall, and some different trade-offs like that to make our rotation work.
This year, didn't we plant some beans pretty early, like even before Memorial Day?
Yes, we did. And it's been a few years that we've had these relatively warm and dry springs, and that always makes us a little nervous. When that planting date starts with a 5 instead of a 6, it always makes you cross your fingers a little bit and hope it works out. But this year, I would say we got lucky again on some of those earlier planting dates. We harvested some excellent beans that were planted in May. And it seems like the earlier in May they were, the little bit better they were, which, I mean, when I say early, we're talking mid-20s. We had some planted on the 30th that hit a bit of a dry spell, especially here in Ridgeville, through July, where we were very hot and dry, and they struggled a little bit through flowering. But that kind of goes with the haves and have-nots of water this year, which we've seen all across the thumb. That some guys got a little bit more water when we needed it than others. Overall, we all had a very good, good crop, but some had a very good, depending on that extra little shot of rain or not.
Some of the other things that are covered in the report.
Yeah, so that report that's out now really just focuses on the variety trial results. So it covers all 12 market classes and 6 total locations for testing. It has columns for maturity, plant height, disease tolerance or resistance. White mold is our big focus in there, as well as lodging, on top of the yield results that are presented. So that's,
do we have any concerns at all, or I guess some questions about what our people like Bush Brothers, what they're preferring as far as varieties go?
Yeah, so that's always a question for our handlers too, and dealers of, you got to know your customer to understand what we're looking at. And that's a big part of the second step of our process in our canning evaluations, is to understand some of these unique, end use trait qualities that some of these varieties do have. One, for example, that we know, Blackbeard. Blackbeard is an excellent canning variety. You'll see it in a can. It can's a really deep black color, which is desired. It's a really, pearly, beautiful bean coming out of the can. Where we've had some other varieties that'll be more of a light brown. And not that there's anything, nutritionally or physically wrong with that product. It's just not as visually appealing. So those things are always important for us to know and understand, and for our dealers to know their customers, and keeps the end use quality a really important trait for us.
So the longer term varieties, are they a little more forgiving when it comes to that visual look? I guess it's kind of a generalized statement, but I'm kind of curious. Uh, when you harvest, as that product is ready to be harvested, sometimes you can't help if it doesn't look good.
Right. And the unique thing about canning quality that we're talking about here too, that if you line up, say 10 varieties next to each other in a dry state, they may all look black. They may all look very good and, virtually identical. But once you actually cook those beans, put them through that blanch process and boil, that's when you'll see the difference come out. That different varieties have a different level of leaching that can take place of the anthocyanin. So that's part of the amino acids within that plant or within that seed coat that keeps that black color. Some are more prone to leaching than others. And the more they leach, the less black they'll appear after canning. But prior to cooking, they're virtually identical. So that's the thing that's always shocking, especially about black beans, that we can have a product that looks excellent, in the beginning, but once we go through that cook process, you can kind of sort out some of those differences. And we would always like to have, a long-term variety, as you mentioned, that, looks good dry, looks good cooked, and also has those great, yield and disease tolerance type traits as well. But it's not always a perfect world though, and sometimes we have some trade-offs, and we'll accept a little more yield for a little less blackness in the can. But as long as it's acceptable for our canning customers, and yields well enough to pay our growers and our producers, that makes us a happy industry.
Harvest has always been very interesting when it comes to dry beans. And in some cases, that's been the determining factor if a grower is going to plant dry beans. Because with soybeans and corn and everything else, I mean, you can just go in with a combine and you can cut it right off. With the dry beans in years past, you had to pull them. And in some cases, even our upright varieties are pretty low to the ground. What are we seeing as far as moving forward with a lot of our availability of seed when it comes to a little bit more of an upright bean?
Yeah, so the industry continues to move in that direction of our upright type architecture. We'd call them indeterminate short vine plants compared to the old bush plants. Which, if you kind of think about that, that bush is that old, seafarer navy bean that's a small bush right on the ground, basically. And once it lays down, it's pretty tough to get that back up.
I remember the Michelite.
Exactly.
Michelite bean. Boy, I mean, those things were like pickles. They just
Yep.
spread out all over the place at high yield, but boy, you had to really dig to pull them out even.
Right. And if we compare what our samples at harvest looked like in those days compared to now, our beans are so much cleaner, so much whiter, so much nicer because of that upright architecture that we have. If you see the plants once they dry down, sometimes I think they almost look like a small Christmas tree. You see those branches headed up and then they come to a point. And that's really brought our industry a long way. And it's still, when you talk to breeders, as they're walking our plots and walking their breeding nurseries that we have in the state, that's something that's still on their radar, that plants need to be upright and need to maintain that architecture, even when we have growth and excessive water, to keep these beans upright so we can continue to push yield, but not lose that structure that plant has.
How many pages are in this report, Scott?
So this report's about 15 pages total, the one that's out right now. We'll have our regional meetings coming up here in December, where we'll go over that entire report as well as some additional information. And following that, we'll have a actually much longer report that includes all our variety results plus all of our other agronomic trials. So you'll see reports from, say, Dr. Christy Sprigg, our weed scientist, on some of the work they've done with overlapping residuals and some different herbicide programs in dry beans. You'll see reports from our breeder, Dr. Francisco Gomez, and some of his products as they've looked at breeding here on the research farm. And Dr. Marty Chilvers looking at some of our fungicide products of how we can better manage disease. That report typically is out in February and is associated with our Bean and Beet Symposium that we'll be having again this year in Saginaw. But this report for now is the short one. But if you come to our December meeting, you'll get kind of a glimpse into what our longer report does look like.
While we're on that subject, I think we've got a slide available to us that kind of gives us a rundown of the program. We could put that up right now.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Kind of guide me through that, Scott.
Yeah, so we'll start off there Monday, December 12th at our Central Michigan Regional Meeting there at the Doubletree Hotel in Bay City. I think most folks are pretty familiar with that. If you can't make that one or you're in the Thumb, on Tuesday, December 13th, we're at our East Michigan meeting at the Franklin Inn in Bad Axe. And then we conclude over on the west side of state, McKenna's Restaurant in Lakeview, where we focus a little bit different. It's more around kidney and cranberry beans, as that's a production that does take place in that part of the state. But all meetings run from 9 till 1 p.m., including lunch. You'll see on the second page there, we do have a little bit of our agenda, laid out. We'll start, with a welcome introduction, and then talk about that 15-page book, our E3465 or dry bean performance trials. We'll go over that for about 20 minutes or so. And then we'll hear a really interesting talk from Dr. Francisco Gomez. So Francisco, myself, and one of his postdocs have been working on a project looking at some historical data. So our variety trials have run in this state for 50 plus years. So we took a subsection of that. The past 5 years, we identified some standard varieties across different locations in Michigan. And really took a deep dive on how those varieties do respond to our different microclimates in the Thumb. And Francisco is going to take some time and go through what he's learned on that project so far. And I think it should be a really interesting talk there, and I'm excited to hear it. Then we'll dive into weed control with Dr. Christy Sprigg and some of our lessons from failed weed control in 2022. Anybody that took a drive around the Thumb, you may have noticed some less than ideal dry bean fields for our weed control and management. The dry spring this year taught me personally a lot of lessons and how I may need to adjust going into 2023. We'll also have Dr. Marty Chilvers, really focused on white mold, when and how to selectively manage. We're going to talk about things like droplet size, gallons per acre, product selection, as well as timing, which is always the big question that we have. We started something new last year too, where we have a small panel discussion. We'll select 3 or 4 growers that are there present, and we'll just go through some basic questions of how they're doing things, how they might be a little different than the group. And we just kind of have an open conversation with everybody at the meeting to be able to ask questions and discuss what's really working and what's not working in dry bean production. So I know I always learn a lot from that, and the groups seem to really enjoy it. And the last talk I'll give that day is an overview of dry bean production in Argentina. So I was able to go down there in May of 2022, which is their harvest season, and get an idea of what their production looks like. I was quite shocked at some of the things we found of how they do things that are dramatically different than we do here. So it was really an eye-opening experience. For the first time in my life, I seen 50,000 acres of light red kidney beans on one farm. And just to understand how they manage that and how their thought process goes into that production was really interesting. So we'll take some time and share with the group, what we learned there. And then the last part, most people are really interested in the marketing report that we do have. So we'll have 3 different marketers coming along to talk about, the fundamentals of the market and hopefully the outlook going forward.
Scott, I'm really curious. You mentioned about that meeting, the last one over on the west side of the state. And again, the beans that you mentioned were the cranberry beans, and what was the other one?
We really kind of focus on our dark red kidneys, our light red kidneys, but light reds and crayons and some white kidneys would be the majority of the focus at that meeting.
And for the people that really don't understand the difference between geography and climate, quite frankly, why is the west side of the state a little bit more conducive to those varieties?
Yep. So in my head, there's two things. They are on sand to sandy loam soils. That those bush beans that we just talked about are dark reds, light reds. Any kidney bean that you can name in our crayons, for the most part, are still in that bush type plant. They're a determinate type variety. They often don't have super strong roots to them, and they can suffer from different root rot diseases. So that lighter sandy soil really helps keeps oxygen to that plant root and seems to help those plants do a little bit better. The second part is irrigation. Most of the beans that you'll find on that side of the state are under irrigation, and they're those determinate type plants that also only flower one time. So if you miss the rain on that flowering, it can be a pretty tough season. But when you have a center pivot irrigation system over top of them, you have them on a lighter type soil, they can be very productive still. And that's why we've seen them kind of hold on to that Montcalm County type geographic area where we do have those two things. And they are still pulled and windrowed for harvest. And we still find all that traditional bean equipment in that area as well.
Do they have good results at harvest time?
Yes, which within bean production, we know it's always variable from year to year. If you look at our bulletin that we discussed, E3465, you'll see that this year we had almost 30 bag type yields on crayons and light reds and dark reds and these bush type plants. So given the right conditions, they can really yield and excel.
I'm just real curious. One more point I want to cover, and that is your trip to Argentina. You mentioned a field of how many acres?
So it was a farm, about 50,000 acres of kidney beans, divided up into 500-acre fields. They cut them perfectly square, and they are lined up one after another, after another, after another. It's really astonishing the sheer area that they have to work with, and the amount of production and how things work there. It's eye-opening to say the least.
So by dividing it all up, that makes it easier to manage?
Correct. Yep. Which I still question how difficult it would be to manage these 500-acre fields that they're working with. Especially when you have one after another after another. But that's how they've kind of divided their system. They call field lots, but they know that they have each different lot. They have their planting dates. They'll plant 500 acres a day, and they'll roll right through them, right through their spring until they come out the other side.
Now, is their production similar to ours? Better? Not as good?
It's always tough to say. Their weather seems to be a little more variable than ours does, and they plant in relatively late season for them. So they have a monsoonal type weather pattern where they get rains through the summer, and then in the winter it does not rain at all. So they'll plant their dry beans on the late half of summer for them. So as the rains begin to stop, they'll plant their dry beans, and then the dry beans will finish out on whatever soil moisture they have left. So as they head into harvest, it'll often never rain until spring again. So they have some different things that make it work to be able to handle that many acres of dry beans and not dramatically lose quality, other than the fact that their harvest moistures are often very low without that additional rainfall or heavy dews that we're used to getting here in Michigan. But it's a very different system from us. If they do have good water, they can grow very nice beans. When they don't have water, like us, it's a little tougher.
So they're what you're saying is they're planting On our calendar, it would be what, late December, early January?
Yep, it seems like anywhere January through maybe March would be their planting type window.
Oh,
And Argentina is also a very long state north to south, so that window can change as you get closer to the equator and when you get farther away. Um, and the other really interesting contrast that we observed there is that dry beans are often planted on their more marginal type farms. Um, that they really take their premium ground, and that's where we're going to grow soybeans. And that ground often gets more water, has more fertility, has better options, and they see more profit in soybeans. Where dry beans get pushed into the more marginal farms that may not have as reliable rainfall historically, maybe not quite the fertility that other farms do have. So
and they have access. They have access to the canners.
So their logistics are a little bit tougher coming out. Their infrastructure has a long way to go. This farm that I mentioned that was 50,000 acres was 70 kilometers. Let's say 50 miles for a rough conversion down a 2-track dirt road. I would equate this to if you drive up to the UP and found an ORV trail. They haul 50,000 acres worth of beans down that trail. So their infrastructure does limit them a little bit, but they're very determined, inventive growers, and they make it work. So they do compete in the export market.
I guess it doesn't make any difference what part of the world agriculture is in. Producers figure out a way to make it work.
That they do, regardless. The beans are going to come to market one way or the other.
And of course, in our particular case, again, we want to reiterate that you've got meetings next week. The week of, what are the dates again on that, Scott?
Yep, December 12th through the 14th. So not this coming week, but the following.
Yep. So for more information on that, we can go to michiganbean.com or we can get a hold of you. How do we do that, Scott?
Yeah, certainly. So michiganbean.com is always a great resource. And if that doesn't have the questions you're looking for, feel free to get a hold of me. My contact information is available on michiganbean.com. Or if you've got a pen handy, you can always give me a call at 810-304-3698.
Okay. Scott Bales, thank you so much for being a part of our broadcast this morning. I'm sure a lot of folks will have the opportunity to see you, talk to you during that 12th, 13th, and 14th of the month of December. And if I don't have a chance to run into you before, have a very happy holiday and a very Merry Christmas to you.
Thanks. You as well, Terry, and always appreciate you having us.